1944, a high-risk bombing mission is taking place against the forces of the Japanese. During this crucial attack on a vital island, an American plane takes a direct hit from anti-aircraft fire. Incredibly, this one plane, this one mission, and this one round from a Japanese gun would play a major role in shaping the fate of the Western world for the next 70 years. This is the story of how one bullet could have changed world history. As the United States turns the momentum in the Pacific and begins to take an offensive strategy, aviators from all over the country would be sent to a brutal and all-out war. This young man pictured here would be one of them. And rather than tell you who he is now, let's see if you can guess who it might be as this story goes along. You have probably heard of him, but you may not know the full details of his extraordinary story. Just for now though, let's call him George, until you can guess who he is. George, like many men, joined the Navy in the first few years of the war, and so after passing training to become a pilot, was assigned to his aircraft, the Avenger torpedo bomber. This new plane had entered service in 1942 to replace the obsolete TBD Devastator. It was primarily a torpedo bomber, but could also be outfitted with standard bombs as well. It would hold a 3-man crew, 1 pilot in the front seat, 1 bombardier and belly gunner in the middle seat, and 1 rear gunner in the back.
Well, the Avenger was the follow-on to the Devastator, which was not really a very good airplane, at least not up against the Japanese Zero and other aircrafts. But the Avenger was an excellent airplane. It was big, could carry a heavy load, came into the war at about the right time. But it was also a multi-purpose airplane. It was not just a torpedo bomber, but they would use it for low-level bombing as well, and was a very good airplane.
It would see its first combat in June of 1942, and while this debut was not fantastic, losing 5 out of 6 bombers in the Battle of Midway, it was concluded that this was due to poor strategy rather than the performance of the plane. In addition, however, it quickly became clear that the Mark 13 torpedo, the primary aerial torpedo used by the US Navy, was in need of a major overhaul. At this time, there were an alarming number of drops that resulted in running too low, sinking to the bottom of the ocean, or even duds that did not explode once they hit their target. Because of this, many Avenger pilots early on had to fly incredibly low and slow to give their ordnance a chance to work correctly. This cost many American aviators their lives in 1942 and 1943. So, in the months that followed, torpedo bombing techniques would be adjusted to protect crews better. The Mark 13 torpedo was improved for higher drop speeds and altitudes, and bombs were also implemented for use in the Avenger to allow for a variety of strategies that helped this aircraft become a crucial asset for the US naval forces in the Pacific. Fortunately, George would be sent to the front in the spring of 1944, so by the time he got there, most of these problems and issues with the plane and its torpedoes had been solved. He would not have to deal with these issues anymore, thankfully, but still had to deal with the Imperial Japanese Navy. Upon his arrival to the Pacific, the war against the Japanese was reaching its climax. The next year in this theater of war would be brutal, with a great number of ships sunk for all sides and thousands of aircrew members lost in the intense fighting. As he prepared to take part in this battle, George was assigned to the aircraft carrier USS San Jacinto. Here, he would take part in his first combat mission, which was the bombing of the Japanese-held Wake Island. After this, for the next few weeks, he would participate in missions leading up to the Battle of the Philippines, and then on June 19th of 1944 would take part in one of the largest and most dramatic aerial battles in World War II, the Marianas turkey shoot. On this day, George would take off from his carrier to strike the Japanese forces that had recently been located near Guam. In this iconic clash, a great number of Navy planes took off to take part in the attack. When they finally found the Japanese fleet, however, it was already evening and they were at the absolute end of their fuel limits. The naval aviators refused to turn back for home, however, at least not until they had hit the prized carriers below them. George, along with many other Avengers and dive bombers, went in after many of the ships, landing fatal hits on 3 different carriers and an assortment of other warships. The Japanese anti-aircraft and Zero fighters defended bravely, however, and a number of U.S. naval aircraft were lost, but the bulk of the force did survive the mission, and George was one of them. As these surviving planes turned back for their own carriers, however, there was a situation developing. The American pilots had pushed their planes to their maximum range, and it had taken them much longer than anticipated to reach their targets. Because of this, darkness was now quickly approaching, and their fuel may run out before they even reached the carriers. Night landings at sea were a very risky business during this time, and no pilot wanted to ditch alone in the open ocean. So, in a bold and unprecedented move, Captain Joseph Clark of the USS Hornet chose to send his searchlights from his carrier directly up into the air, lighting up the night sky so his aircraft, running low on fuel and flying in total darkness, could find the ship and make it home safely, despite the clear risk that this put them at from enemy submarine attack. Within a few minutes, every other ship in the 58th Task Force followed suit, and their searchlights were turned on as a beacon for the lost aircraft. Because of this courageous move, the majority of the U.S. naval aircraft were able to reach the vicinity of the fleet. However, many lacked the fuel to make it all the way to the carrier deck. Some crash-landed on the carrier decks, and some bailed out, but a great number, like our pilot George, would be forced to make a crash landing in the ocean. Fortunately, he would bring his Avenger down in the water nearby to a U.S. destroyer, and was able to be picked up and was back on the USS San Jacinto very soon. This incredible ordeal would begin to shape George as a young man, but his trials were far from over, as the mission that could have easily changed world history was yet to come. After the carrier was restocked with new aircraft to replace the many that were lost in this mission, George and the other airmen were back at battle and continued the campaign against the Japanese. Shortly after, on July 24th of 1944, George was credited with, along with one other pilot, of sinking a Japanese cargo ship. This was no doubt a mission in which the new and improved Mark 13 torpedo would play a major role. As missions continued and the war went on, he continued to serve well. That is, until the fateful day of September 2nd of 1944. In this mission, George and 3 other Avengers were assigned to take part in a raid against a small Japanese island by the name of Chichijima. This island, however, was very well defended. As George and the other planes came in for their bombing runs, Japanese anti-aircraft opened up on the flight. Before they could release their payload, an anti-aircraft round struck George's Avenger. Almost immediately, the plane caught fire, and flames and smoke began to pour from the fuselage. In the same volley of fire that sent this round into the engine, another round struck and killed one of the crew members in the aircraft. It was clear that George was in trouble and needed to act fast. Bravely putting duty first, however, despite the fact that he was literally on fire, he continued the attack run and released the bombs from the bomb bay, hitting multiple targets on the ground below. As his Avenger continued to burn, George was somehow able to keep the plane in the air. Being a Navy pilot, he was all too familiar with the stories of the Japanese treatment of POWs. Oftentimes, captured American airmen were either tortured, starved to death, or simply executed.
The best example you can look at is the Doolittle flyers that were captured by the Japanese. If I have my numbers correctly, there were five Doolittle raiders captured by the Japanese. 2 of them were executed, 1 died in captivity, and 1 was a prisoner for the rest of the war and was never the same, according to stories. So the Japanese did not treat their captured prisoners well. They were very different from the Germans, who actually treated captured aviators as almost comrades. They were put in different prison camps. The Japanese were not that way.
So rather than bailing out over the Japanese island, he opted to take his chances in the burning plane, trying to get as far from the enemy troops as possible before going down. After the fire was brought under control and he was able to put a few miles between them and Chichijima, George gave the order to bail out to the one surviving crew member that was still on board. As the crew member jumped, however, tragedy would strike again. Apparently, for reasons unknown, his parachute did not deploy, and George's fellow airman fell to his death, striking the water below. Fortunately for George, though, his fate would not follow that of his other two crew members. When he leapt from his aircraft, his chute deployed, and he did in fact float safely into the Pacific waters. Thankfully, friendly American fighters flew overhead, keeping any Japanese boats away until help could arrive.
Being that the TBM has a 3-man crew, that any time it was shot down, shot at, or had a hard landing, the chances of losing somebody was, pretty high. In the cases of those aviators who survived the downing of their aircraft and their loss of their gunner radioman, making them the only surviving crewman, I think would weigh pretty heavily on a person, for the rest of their life.
Finally, after floating in the water for hours in his life raft, George was picked up by the USS Finback, an American submarine. He would remain on board this sub for a month until he was reunited with his shipmates back on the USS San Jacinto, ending this traumatic and trying ordeal. And this brings us to the question finally, how could this mission have possibly played a major impact on world history? It was a single pilot in a single plane in the largest war ever fought. And that is because, in case you have not yet guessed it, this young pilot, George, would grow up to live quite a life. He would go on to be a member of the United States House of Representatives, the director of the CIA, and finally, the 41st President of the United States. This aviator was none other than George H.W. Bush. For decades, he would serve as one of the top political leaders in the world, and for 4 years, the leader of the United States of America. This was only possible because the young George was able to survive this unbelievable ordeal and a brutal tour of duty in the Pacific Theater as a combat pilot. Here we can see his name listed in the day's report log from the USS San Jacinto along with a description of his mission. Launched 4 TBMs and 8 F-6Fs. Then, a short time later, recovered 8 F-6Fs and 3 TBMs. One TBM, number 46214, having crashed into sea 9 miles northeast of the southern tip of Chichijima due to enemy aircraft fire. Pilot G.H.W. Bush was recovered by submarine. But crew composed of Lieutenant White and Delaney are believed to be missing in action. If the anti-aircraft round that had struck the engine of his plane had simply hit a few feet closer, or had he been given the faulty parachute instead of his wingman, or still had he been one of the 50% of aviators on board the USS San Jacinto that perished in this combat tour, then the world would likely be very different today. Not only would the United States have lost a future president that would be generally rated well by historians, but they would have lost a second as well, as George's son would go on to serve 2 terms himself as the elected leader of the United States. Many years later, George would find out that other aviators were forced to bail out in the raids that took place in the area around Chichijima. Historians would determine that tragically, these men were likely eaten and cannibalized by some of the Japanese soldiers here in the most brutal and horrific way possible. It is said that after learning this, George simply paused and stood in silence.
I think it's part of human nature to wonder what you could have done different. I think it's also part of the military ethos to feel as if you were a team, and anytime someone on the team doesn't make it with you, you do have a little bit inside of you that feels like you failed, even when you didn't.
Speaking of his time in the Pacific later on, George would state that the mission in which he was shot down and the events that followed would shape him profoundly as a man, leading him to ask the question, why had I been spared and what did God have for me?
It must have had an impact on him. If you think about the war heroes that have been presidents, you think of John Kennedy and the PT boats, and you think of George Bush and his Avenger. And I believe those experiences had an impact on those people, on those gentlemen, and made them better presidents than they might have been otherwise.
He would go on to be awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for his role in this mission. Regardless of what your political stance might be, and whether or not you agree with how he may have governed as a politician, we can agree on one thing. This Avenger pilot, who answered the call to take on the Japanese in World War II, and who nearly paid for it with his life, is a hero and an absolutely fantastic story of bravery and love for his country.
If you want to see incredible aircraft like this Avenger torpedo bomber, then please consider coming out to the Commemorative Air Force Airbase, Arizona, here just outside of Phoenix.
Please comment what story I should cover next, and please consider subscribing.